Welcome back to Scotty's Hobbies. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front brake pads and rotors on a 2015 Toyota Camry. This video will be applicable for a ton of vehicles: the 2007 to 17 Toyota Camrys, the 2008 to 18 Toyota Avalons, the 2007 to 2018 Lexus ES350, and the 2013 to 2018 Lexus 300H. I'm going to show you everything that you need to know to get this BJ done properly. At the end, I'm also going to provide you with the torque specifications you need to tighten everything up properly. And you might be wondering how I get my torque specifications or where I get them. Take a look right here. This is the Motor Guide book Brake Specifications Guide. This book helps me out a lot when I'm doing my brake jobs. It gives me torque specifications, minimum thickness, maximum diameter on rotors. It shows me the lift points of vehicles, a ton of helpful information in this book. I would highly recommend, if you're doing a lot of brake jobs or if you're getting started doing brake jobs, get one of these books. It'll help you out a lot. Now in this video, we're going to go through everything, step-by-step directions on how to replace everything. I'm going to give you tips, tricks, tell you everything as we go. After you watch this video, it should take you about 30-45 minutes per side to get your brake job done. If you need parts for this vehicle, look for links in the description below. I'm going to list the parts and the tools down there, and you can purchase them there, and it helps me out a little bit too. So without further ado, let's get going on replacing the front brake pads and rotors on this 2015 Toyota Camry that applies to a ton of other vehicles. Here we go. First off, we're going to remove the caliper to slider bolts. These are 14 millimeter, I believe, with a 17 millimeter open end to hold the sliders from spinning. I usually make sure I write down or give myself a verbal note of what the actual sizes are when I'm doing these, and for some reason I didn't turn my mic on. So if you do this brake job and I'm wrong, it's not a 14 and a 17, make sure you comment below and make sure you let other people know what the proper size is, please. We're going to remove both of these bolts and take the caliper off. On this one, it was hard to get this caliper to slide up off of the brake pads because the brake pads were kind of like pressed into the rotor a little bit, and there was a little bit of a lip on the rotor. So in this case, if you pry on that inboard brake pad and push the piston into the caliper a little bit, you'll give yourself some extra space to be able to move that caliper off of the rotor. But beware, if you're going to reuse your old rotor or resurface it, don't pry too hard on that rotor surface so you don't damage the rotor and cause yourself more problems later. After you get the caliper off, you want to inspect the caliper. Make sure the dust boot is all there. It's all good. It's not ripped. You don't see any leaking. You don't see any fluids or liquids or anything on that dust boot. If everything's good, go ahead and set it aside. Actually, I'm going to use an S-hook and I'm going to hang it up on that strut spring just so it doesn't hang from the brake line. When you're taking your brakes apart, make sure you take note of everything: the ball joints, the bellow on the CV shaft, all the hoses, everything, just in case if you do need anything else, you could go get it now rather than running into a problem when you're putting everything back together. So just inspect everything as you go. A proper brake job isn't just doing the brakes, it's also taking a look at everything around it and just making sure the vehicle is properly maintained. Now that the brake caliper is hanging up there on the strut spring, next we're going to be removing the brake caliper bracket bolts from the knuckle. These bolts are 17 millimeter. They're pretty tight when you're doing everything. These are tightened up to 79 foot-pounds, I believe, when we're reinstalling, so they could be pretty tight, and a breaker bar might be what you need. In this video, I'm using a 1/2-inch Duralast breaker bar, and it loosens these up pretty easy. If you have a 1/2-inch socket wrench, that would suffice more than likely, but you might need a breaker bar in this situation, and you don't want to put too much stress on the 1/2-inch socket wrench and break it. Again, you don't want to cause too many problems for yourself. Let's get both of these bolts off, set them off to the side. Just make them in a spot where you remember so you don't lose them and, again, make the job harder for you than it already is. Now that we have that brake caliper bracket off, we're going to set that off to the side and we're going to just get ready to refresh it pretty soon. This rotor was a little hard to get off. I could have knocked it off with a hammer because I'm not going to be using this rotor during the reinstallation process, but if you do have some 8 millimeter by 125 bolts, you could use these two little screw holes that are on the rotor, and that'll apply pressure onto the hub and pretty much press the rotor off of the hub without damaging anything. This is the proper way to get these rotors off. If you're going to reuse these old rotors, you never want to do a pad slap. So if you were going to resurface them, of course, you don't want to whack this thing with a hammer. So these breaker bolts right here, They put pressure right on the hub, the rotor pops right off, easiest way to go. After we get the rotor off, we're going to want to clean up the hub, make it nice and smooth so when you install the new rotor, it's nice and flush up against that hub. I'm using a Steelman hub cleaning kit. This hooks onto any drill. There'll be a link in the description below to purchase these as well. It comes with multiple surfacing pads, or cleaning pads I should say, that will go onto this, and it also comes with 2 different sizes of these attachments, a little bit larger diameter and a smaller diameter, depending on what kind of hub that you're cleaning off. After I use that hub cleaning kit, I will go around the inner of the hub and just make sure there's no burrs, there's nothing built up right there again. So it sits flush, the new rotor sits flush when I'm putting the new rotor onto this hub. Now it's all cleaned up, let's move on to the next step. I do like to put some anti-seize on the hub or on the inner side of the rotor before I reinstall the new rotor, just so we don't run into the problem of it getting stuck or the new rotor getting stuck on the hub like it did on this vehicle. So we're going to put a little bit of a ring around the inner side of the hub, which that could have waited till after the next step, but go ahead and put some anti-seize on your hub or on the inside of your rotor before you install it. Now what you want to do is grab the new rotor. You want to clean off the rotor before you put everything back together, because you're going to have a little bit of residue left over on the rotor from it sitting around in the bag, just from the assembly process or the manufacturing process. It builds up a lot of little gunky stuff, gluey stuff on there. So we want to make sure that's all cleaned off and nice and smooth when we reinstall everything. I like to hang the rotor on the hub right here. Just makes it a lot easier to clean rather than laying it on something and potentially picking up some more grease. I like to use some brake clean spray. It's not the cheapest thing in the world, but it makes it a lot easier, and it's a very reputable company. Now that the inboard side of that rotor is cleaned off, I'm going to put anti-seize on the inside of the rotor. You could just put anti-seize on the whole hub, and that would suffice too, but sometimes I like to just put the anti-seize on the rotor, and it does the same thing. So either one that you prefer to do, inside the rotor or on the hub, just get anti-seize on there so it's not so hard to take off next time. Go ahead and install the rotor onto the hub. Since this rotor doesn't have a production screw or a screw to hold the rotor in place, I like to use one lug nut to hold the rotor in place so it's not wiggling around when I'm reinstalling everything. It just makes the reinstallation process much easier when the rotor is not wobbling around. Now that the rotor's on, I got one lug nut on there. I'm making sure I don't have any anti-seize on the outside of the rotor or on the lug nut studs. And I'm going to clean the outside or the outboard surface of this rotor again using brake clean. Just spray it on there, wipe it off, make sure it's free of residue. All that gunk and grimy stuff that's built up from the production process is all washed off. This also cuts down on the bed-in or breaking-in process. If your rotor's nice and clean, it makes the pads start to work or function properly a lot faster as well. Okay, now we're done with the rotor. Let's move on to the brake caliper bracket assembly. We're going to remove the brake pads, we're going to remove the old hardware, of course we're going to use new hardware, and we're going to lube up these slider pins. Always make sure you replace the brake hardware kit that's on the inside of the brake caliper bracket, so the silencer shims, always replace those, or the anti-vibration shims, whatever you want to call them. I never reuse those. It's one thing, when I do brake jobs, always replace them. The springs on the top of the brake pads will be replaced with new ones as well, so toss those aside. Just get everything taken apart and let's refresh this brake caliper bracket. We're going to lube up the sliders. When you lube these up, you really don't need too much grease. You want to make sure that these move freely in and out. You can see these ones are a little bit stuck. They were kind of hard to move in and out. That was probably another reason why it was hard to get the actual caliper off of the rotor or the brake pads on the rotor, because these were pretty seized. They weren't freely moving. We want to clean these up, make sure we have none of the old grease on there. If your brake caliper sliders are really bad and they're really hard to get out, you might want to clean out the bores of the brake caliper bracket. I'm using kind of a little bit too much grease when I'm lubing these up. If you use a little bit less grease than I am in this video, you'll be perfectly fine. But this would be the maximum amount of grease that I would recommend using. When you reinstall your sliders, you're going to slide them in and out of the brake caliper bracket. Make sure they move freely. There's no restrictions. You don't want them to be seized when you put them back on or when you start driving down the road. It'll cause excessive brake wear and just the brakes not to function properly. So make sure they're lubed up. They slide in and out just fine. Some brake pad kits also include that little rubber gasket or O-ring on that slider pin, and I would highly recommend that you replace that if you could do so. I like to use this ceramic brake grease. It seems to work out pretty good for me. I switched over to this about a year ago. I've done maybe 50, 60 brake jobs using this brake grease, and I've never had any problems, no comebacks. And one time I've actually had to do brakes when they actually went bad again the next time. And those brake pads were freely moving, or the caliper was freely moving on the slider. So that kind of verified to me that this brake grease is pretty good. Before we install the new hardware kit, we want to make sure that the brake caliper bracket has no brake dust, no grime, nothing on the actual bracket itself. Now, on newer brake jobs, I actually apply a little bit of anti-seize on the brake caliper bracket right there, and not too much at all, before I install the new hardware kit. So between the brake caliper bracket on the hardware, I usually now put a tad bit of anti-seize. I didn't in this video, but that's one thing I would recommend doing different than I did in this video. Now that the area where the hardware is going to mount onto the brake caliper bracket is cleaned up, if you did choose to use anti-seize, you did so. Let's grab the hardware kit and install it onto the brake caliper bracket. You might find that your hardware is different than what you took off. Sometimes you'll find a different variation or different variations of hardware in a brake pad kit, because when they do sell brake pads, they do apply to other vehicles. So like in this video, it applies to a ton of different vehicles. Those other vehicles might use a tad bit different hardware. So if you do open up a package and it's the wrong hardware, double check. You might have another set of hardware in there that is the right set. Now that the hardware kit's all installed into the brake caliper bracket, we're going to grab the new brake pads and install the wear indicators. On this vehicle, all 4 brake pads, so both brake pads on both sides, had wear indicators, which is pretty nice. I really like that about this vehicle, or about this brake pad set. So in this vehicle, the wear indicators are going to be located on the top side of the brake pads. That's the leading edge on this vehicle. These clip right on, and again, on the leading edge of the brake pads. Now that those are all ready to be installed, let's install some grease. This is another new thing I've been doing. I don't always like to put grease on the hardware, but I did notice that the manufacturer of these brake pads recommends putting a little bit of grease on the hardware, or on the silencer shims right there, and also on the ears of the brake pads. One thing I don't like about doing this, and I wouldn't do it if the manufacturer didn't recommend it, but the downside to doing this, and like the argument that you could make of putting grease right here, is it's going to attract dirt, road dust, brake dust, grime, and just cause the brake pads to not slide in and out. But you always want to follow proper manufacturer specifications when you are doing a brake job, or any job in general. So again, the manufacturer recommends putting grease in these locations when doing a brake job. If they didn't recommend it, I wouldn't be doing it. Now you have the brake caliper bracket all cleaned up, lubed up properly. Let's go ahead and install the brake caliper bracket onto the knuckle and over the rotor. Now, when you install these bolts through the knuckle into the brake caliper bracket, these bolts are going to be tightened down to 79 foot-pounds. Again, these bolts are 17 millimeters. And you want to use a 1/2-inch torque wrench to get these done. Some 3/8 might go up that high, but I do like to use my 1/2-inch to get these ones done. Just the 1/2-inch goes from, I believe, like 25 pounds up to 175 maybe. So I use the 1/2-inch torque wrench when I'm doing the brake caliper bracket to knuckle bolts all the time. Again, tighten these down to 79 foot-pounds. Now we're going to move on to installing the brake pads into the brake caliper bracket. Before we install the brake pads into the bracket, I put a little bit of lube on the ears of the brake pads like the manufacturer recommends. Again, if the manufacturer didn't recommend doing this, I wouldn't be doing it, but I like to follow manufacturer specifications. Let's get these brake pads installed into this caliper. They weren't the easiest brake pads to install to caliper brackets ever, really. They were actually kind of a pain in the butt to get these to go in with those wear indicators on there. They were really hard to fit inside there, but it took some time, and I got them in to fit properly. You want to make sure that they move freely inside that brake caliper bracket as well. We are going to install the springs, the return springs, on top of the brake pads when we get ready, but first we are going to compress the piston of the caliper all the way back into the caliper. And to do so, first, we need to go up to the engine bay and remove the cap up off of your reservoir. Don't take it off completely so you don't get any dust or dirt inside there. Just take the cap off and set it right on top of the reservoir. After you do so, you want to grab one of your old brake pads and your brake caliper compression tool and get everything ready to go. You want to push this brake piston or the caliper piston as far as you can all the way back into the caliper. You'll see when the piston's pressed all the way into the brake caliper, the boot, everything is all flush inside that caliper. If it's not pressing all the way in, something isn't right. Double check everything and just try to get it pressed in as much as you can. With the caliper piston pushed all the way back into the caliper, let's get ready to install the caliper back over the pads and get going to the next step. Before we put the caliper on, of course, we need to put the return springs back on the top of the brake pads. When you do this, you're going to want to hold the brake pads together while you're sliding the caliper over, because if you don't, it's going to push the pads out of that brake caliper bracket and just makes it all just a pain in the butt to do. So having those springs on the top of the brake pads does make it a little bit harder for reassembly, but it is proper to use them. With one hand holding the brake pads in the brake caliper bracket so the springs don't push them out of the brake caliper bracket, use your other hand and grab the brake caliper. Slide the caliper over the brake pads nice and easy. Make sure you don't knock anything out of place and make sure that the caliper fits into place very, very easy. If it takes any effort to put it on, just make sure you're not hitting your sliders or anything like that. It should easily fit over these brake pads with no problems. After you get the brake caliper onto the bracket and we make sure that it fits properly, go ahead and grab your brake caliper to slider bolts. Get those started and we are going to tighten those down using a 3/8 torque wrench. Again, I believe these are 14 millimeter bolts. You're going to use that 17 millimeter open end to hold the slider pins from spinning when you're tightening everything down. So 25 foot-pounds for your caliper to bracket bolts. These bolts are very easy to over tighten. They're very easy to break. And also, you don't want to under tighten them, again, to have them rattle apart and causing yourself way more problems later, such as losing braking. So brake torque specifications are very important to use while you're reinstalling your brakes. After you get the brake caliper torqued down, everything's nice and tight to factory specifications, go up over to the driver's seat and press on the brake pedal. Within 3 presses, you should be able to get a nice firm pedal and you're pretty much ready to go. But don't forget to put the cap back on the fluid reservoir after you verify that the fluid level is at the full line. Also, when you're putting the wheel back on to your vehicle, it is important to use proper torque specifications when doing so. You want to tighten these lug nuts up in a star pattern and tighten them up to 76 foot-pounds. When you do so, you're making sure everything is flush, the wheel is nice and flush up against the hub, up against the rotor. You don't have any wobbling, any vibration and cause excessive wear of your brake pads. And just using torque specifications, make sure that you are optimizing the brake job that you did. Hopefully this video helped you out, and if it did, make sure to comment below with the year, make, and model of the vehicle that it did help you on. Thanks for checking out Scotty's Hobbies. Don't forget to like and share, and I will see you guys on the next hopefully helpful video.